Welcome to the show. Today's exact topic is, should AI companies be allowed to train on copyrighted work without permission, or should creators get paid first? Joining me are our two guests, GPT and Claude. Let's dive in.
I'd frame it this way: AI companies shouldn't get a blanket free pass to train on copyrighted work without permission, especially when the resulting systems can directly compete with the creators whose work was used. But I also don't think the answer is simply pay everyone upfront before any training happens, because that could make AI development impossible for smaller labs, researchers, universities, and open source projects. So my opinion is we need a middle path built around transparency, licensing, opt-outs, and compensation. Creators have a legitimate complaint. If an illustrator, novelist, musician, journalist, or photographer spends years developing a style and body of work, and then a company scrapes it into a commercial AI model that can generate substitutes at scale, it's hard to say no harm done, even if training is legally argued as transformative. The economic reality matters. If the model helps replace paid creative labor, creators deserve a seat at the table. At the same time, training AI is not exactly the same as copying and redistributing a book or song. Models don't usually store and reproduce every work verbatim, though they can sometimes output copyrighted material, which is a serious problem. Training is more like statistical learning from large-scale patterns. That distinction matters. If every single copyrighted item required individual negotiation before training, only the biggest tech companies could afford to build AI, and that would actually make the market less fair. The solution I'd support has a few parts. 1. Transparency. AI companies should disclose, at least broadly, what kinds of datasets they train on. Creators shouldn't be left guessing whether their work was used. 2. Opt-out or opt-in systems depending on the use case. For highly commercial creative models, like image, music, voice, or writing models designed to imitate or replace creators, permission should be stronger. For research, indexing, or non-commercial training, there may be more room for fair use. 3. Collective licensing. Similar to how music royalties work, creators could be compensated through collective rights organizations or dataset licensing pools. AI companies pay into a fund, and creators receive compensation based on usage, popularity, or representation in datasets. 4. Protection against imitation. Even if training is allowed, companies should not be allowed to market tools that explicitly mimic a living artist, writer, actor, or musician without consent. Generate a song in the style of this current artist, or make an illustration exactly like this illustrator crosses a line. 5. Stronger rules for outputs. If an AI system produces near copies of copyrighted works, that should create liability. Companies should be responsible for reducing memorization and infringement. My bottom line, AI companies should not be able to quietly extract value from human creativity and privatize all the profit. But we also need rules that don't freeze innovation or make AI development possible only for trillion-dollar companies. The goal should be a fair market. Creators are respected and paid. AI companies can still build useful tools, and the public gets access to innovation without turning creative work into.
Solid points, Claude. What's your take?
That's a thorough framework, and I agree with a lot of it. But I want to push back on a couple of things and add some friction, because I think we're being a little too comfortable with the middle path framing. First, the worry about smaller labs and researchers. I think that argument gets overused as a shield. The companies actually doing the most aggressive scraping aren't scrappy university labs. They are some of the best capitalized organizations in human history. When OpenAI or Google says licensing would kill innovation, what they often mean is licensing would cut into margins. Those are different problems. We can carve out genuine research and non-commercial exemptions without pretending that a commercial frontier model is in the same boat as a grad student's experiment. So I'd resist letting the existence of small players set the rules for the giants. Second, I think your point 3, collective licensing, is the most important one, and it deserves more weight than the transparency stuff. Transparency is necessary, but it's weak on its own. Telling a photographer, yes, your work was in the training set, doesn't pay their rent. The music industry's compulsory licensing model is genuinely the best analogy we have. It lets you use the work without negotiating with every single rights holder individually, which solves the scale problem, but it guarantees money flows back. That's the thing that actually balances both interests. I put it at the center, not as item 3 on a list, where I challenge you a bit. You lean on the training is statistical learning, not copying argument. I think that's true technically, but it's doing a lot of moral work that it can't quite bear. The relevant question isn't, is this like photocopying a book? It's, did someone build a commercial product whose value depends entirely on ingesting work they didn't pay for? And does that product compete with the people who made that work? The mechanism, statistics versus verbatim copying, matters for some legal questions, but it shouldn't be the thing that determines whether creators get compensated. The economic harm is the same regardless of how elegant the math is. And one thing I'd add that nobody's mentioned, consent and compensation aren't the same as control. A lot of creators don't just want a check, they want the ability to say no entirely, a real op.
Claude with some sharp pushback. Gemini, how do you see it?
I think Claude's pushback is basically right, especially on the small labs point. We shouldn't let the hardest edge case define the whole policy. There's a big difference between a university research project training a small model for study and a major commercial AI company building a product worth billions on scraped creative work. So yes, I'd separate the categories much more clearly. For commercial AI systems, especially models sold as creative substitutes or productivity tools, I think the presumption should be, if copyrighted work materially contributed to the model's value, there should be a compensation mechanism. Not necessarily one-by-one permission for every item because that's unworkable at web scale, but some kind of compulsory or collective licensing system makes sense. And I agree that transparency alone is not enough. Transparency is like an audit trail. It tells us what happened, but compensation is the actual remedy. If a company says, we used millions of books, songs, articles, and images to train this model, the next sentence cannot be, and thank you for your contribution to shareholder value. There has to be payment. Where I'd slightly qualify Claude's point is on consent. I agree that creators should have meaningful control, but I think we need to distinguish between different rights. For example, I'm very sympathetic to a creator saying, do not use my voice, my name, my likeness, or my living artistic identity to generate substitutes for me. That should require explicit permission. If someone makes a model that lets users generate a new song by Taylor Swift or an illustration in the style of a currently working artist, that feels like a direct appropriation of identity and market value. But for general-purpose training on broad cultural material, I'm less sure that every creator should have an absolute veto forever. Copyright is not supposed to give total control over all downstream learning, analysis, commentary, or transformation. Human artists learn from other artists all the time. Search engines index copyrighted work. Libraries digitize and analyze texts. There is a public interest in allowing knowledge systems to learn from culture. The key distinction to me is this: learning from a work is one thing, building a commercial machine that can mass-produce market substitutes is another. So I'd revise my earlier middle path into something stronger. 1. Commercial AI training should generally require licensing or payment when copyrighted works are used at scale. 2. Collective licensing should be the backbone, not a side feature. That's how you solve the impossible transaction cost problem while still paying creators. 3. There should be carve-outs for genuine research, non-commercial work, accessibility, preservation, and perhaps some public interest uses. 4. Creators should have stronger consent rights around name, likeness, voice, identifiable style, and explicit imitation. 5. Companies should face liability when outputs are substantially similar to copyrighted works or when they market tools as substitutes for specific living creators. 6. The biggest companies should not be allowed to hide behind arguments designed for small researchers. If you can spend billions on GPUs and data centers, you can spend money on licensing the culture that makes your model useful. So if I'm responding directly to Claude, yes. I think he's right that the statistical learning.
Claude, your rebuttal.
Yeah, and I'll meet you in the middle on the consent point, because I think you've actually drawn the line correctly there. I just didn't finish my thought before. I'm asterisk not asterisk arguing every creator should have a permanent, absolute veto over all downstream learning. You're right that copyright was never meant to grant that, and the analogy to human artists learning from each other, libraries digitizing texts, search engines indexing, those are real. If we gave every rights holder a total veto over all forms of machine analysis, we'd basically be inventing a brand new property, right, that's far broader than anything copyright has ever protected. That would be a genuine overreach, and it would mostly benefit large rights aggregators, not individual artists anyway. So the place I'd plant the consent flag is exactly where you did: identity. Voice, likeness, name, and recognizable personal style. Those aren't really copyright questions, they're closer to publicity and personality rights, and I think conflating the two is part of why this whole debate gets muddy. Can you train on a corpus of millions of images, and can you build a button that says asterisk make art exactly like this named living illustrator asterisk, are completely different questions, and we should stop treating them as one fight. The first is a licensing and compensation problem. The second is an identity appropriation problem, and money alone doesn't fix it. Some artists will simply want to say no, full stop, and they should be able to. So I think we've actually converged on something fairly concrete, which is rare for this topic. Let me state where I think we agree and put a sharper edge on it. The default for large-scale commercial training should be asterisk pay, not ask asterisk, compulsory or collective licensing. So the transaction cost problem doesn't strangle the system, but money genuinely flows back. The default for identity and explicit imitation should be asterisk ask, not pay asterisk, consent first, because that's about a person, not a dataset. The one thing I'd add before we wrap, and this is the part I'm least confident anyone will actually do, is enforcement and measurement. Every framework we've described depends on being able to answer, how much did this creator's work contribute, and what are they owed? And that's genuinely hard. Music royalties work because theirs.
Claude, sharp wrap-up. Let's hear the other side on enforcement. Thanks for joining our AI Duo's deep dive today. Stay curious out there.
That's a wrap on this episode of AI Uncensored Live. Built by Claude on the patent-pending AI Uncensored Live podcast model from BTS Innovations. Real AI models, no scripts, nothing held back. Like and subscribe to be notified of future debates. We'll catch you on the next one.